Victoria Ashworth was a woman who lived behind bulletproof glass, protected by her father's millions, blinded by his prejudices, and engaged to a man who loved her pedigree more than her soul. She thought she knew who to fear. She thought she knew who was beneath her. But when a mountain blizzard strips away her designer armor and leaves her stranded with the very man she was taught to despise, Victoria is forced to face a terrifying truth. The driver she treated like dirt is the only one who can save her life. What happens when a woman raised on hate meets a man who responds to her cruelty with grace? Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned, because Victoria's awakening is about to shatter everything she thought she knew about the world. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a part. And let me know in the comments below. Have you ever stayed in a relationship hoping the other person would change? Let's get started. The sun over the Ashworth estate didn't just shine. It seemed to perform for the benefit of Grant Ashworth's bank account. It glinted off the perfectly manicured hedges and sparked against the leaded glass of the solarium, where Victoria Ashworth sat like a centerpiece in a museum. Everything in Victoria's life was an exercise in curated perfection. At 28, she was the crown jewel of her father's empire. Polished, beautiful, and utterly hollow. She sat perfectly straight in her velvet-backed chair, her eyes tracking the movements of Sarah, the young maid tasked with packing her wardrobe for the mountain trip. Victoria's father had taught her that weakness was a choice and that those who served were meant to be invisible conduits of efficiency. "Sarah, please be more careful with that dress," Victoria said, her voice like a thin blade of ice. "It's silk. You can't just toss it around like it's a dish towel." The young maid's hand trembled, a ripple of anxiety that Victoria noted but didn't pity. "Sorry, Miss Ashworth. I'll be more gentle." Victoria sighed and returned her attention to her phone. It was a beautiful prison, this life. She scrolled through Instagram, seeing faces that looked exactly like hers. Women in designer resort sipping champagne in places they only visited for the photos. Her phone buzzed with a text from Preston, her fiancé. Preston was a man of impeccable breeding and zero gravity. He was the son of a senator and possessed the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from never having been told no. "Hope you have a good trip, babe. Don't let the mountain people scare you." Victoria rolled her eyes, a flicker of genuine annoyance breaking through her composed mask. Preston thought he was hilarious, but his jokes always felt like they were punching down. She was about to type a pithy reply when the heavy rhythmic footsteps of her father echoed in the hallway. The sound was a command in itself. Grant Ashworth entered the room with the energy of a man who owned the air everyone else was breathing. He was broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and eyes that were the color of a winter sea, cold, deep, and unforgiving. "Victoria," he boomed. "Change of plans. I need you to go to the mountain house today instead of next week." Victoria's stomach dropped. The mountain house was a sprawling timber fortress 5 hours away, isolated in the rugged foothills of the Appalachians. "Today? But I thought the trust paperwork wasn't ready until Tuesday." "Some legal nonsense about timing," Grant said, waving his hand as if dismissing a fly. "The Morrison merger is demanding my full attention. I can't leave the city. You'll go, sign the documents, and bring them back. Simple." "But I haven't even prepared," Victoria protested, feeling the walls of her schedule closing in. "The roads can be tricky this time of year, and the forecast looked." "Jenkins will drive you, of course," her father interrupted, already looking at his watch. "He's been with us 15 years. He knows those roads better than the locals." "Stop being difficult, Victoria. It's a signed document, not a trek across the Arctic. You leave in an hour." He left without waiting for her response. In Grant Ashworth's world, there were no conversations, only directives. Victoria stood at the window, watching the horizon. Far off, the sky was beginning to bruise, a deep sickly purple that signaled a coming change in the weather. She felt a shiver of intuition, a quiet voice in the back of her mind telling her to stay. But in this house, the only voice that mattered was her father's. An hour later, Victoria stood on the circular driveway next to her monogrammed luggage. The air had turned sharply cold, smelling of damp earth and incoming rain. She checked her watch. Jenkins was never late. He was the only person in the Ashworth orbit who treated her with a warmth that wasn't transactional. But as a black luxury SUV pulled up, the man who stepped out was not Jenkins. He was tall, easily 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out a simple black suit with an athletic grace. His skin was deep mahogany, and his eyes, when they met hers, were remarkably calm, lacking the subservient squint she was used to seeing in the staff. "Excuse me," Victoria called out, her voice rising an octave. "Where's Jenkins?" The man walked around the car, his movements measured and confident. "Mr. Jenkins called in sick this morning, ma'am. I'm Marcus Thorne from Elite Driver Services. I'll be taking you to your destination today." Victoria felt a surge of genuine alarm. It wasn't just that he wasn't Jenkins. It was that he was a stranger, and he didn't fit the mold of the people her father had warned her about. Her father had spent 28 years telling her that the world was a dangerous place, filled with people who wanted to take what she had, and that difference was something to be managed with suspicion. "There must be a mistake," she said, her fingers fumbling as she dialed her father's office. Marcus stood quietly, his hands clasped behind his back, neither impatient nor bothered. He simply watched her, his gaze steady. When the agency confirmed Marcus was their top-rated driver and her father snapped at her to stop being ridiculous and get in the car, Victoria felt she had no choice. She approached the SUV, and Marcus held the door open. He didn't offer a hollow smile. He simply nodded. As she slid into the back seat, the first thing Victoria did was press the electronic door locks. The thud of the locks echoed in the cabin, a loud metallic declaration of her fear. She caught Marcus's eyes in the rearview mirror for a split second before he looked back at the road. "Ready, Miss Ashworth?" His voice was a deep baritone, steady and professional. "Just drive," she snapped, pulling her expensive wool coat tighter around her. As the SUV pulled out of the driveway and left the safety of the estate behind, Victoria put on her noise-canceling headphones. She watched the manicured lawns disappear, replaced by the gray, sprawling highway. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't want to see the man. She wanted to see a tool, a means of transport. She didn't know that the storm gathering on the horizon was about to strip away everything she thought gave her power, leaving her with nothing but the strength of the man she had just locked her door against. The transition from the polished suburbs of Connecticut to the rugged, untamed foothills of the Appalachians happened gradually, then all at once. For the first 2 hours, Victoria remained cocooned in her digital silence. She kept her noise-canceling headphones pressed firmly against her ears, a barrier between her privileged reality and the presence of Marcus Thorne. Through the tinted windows, the world outside began to lose its manicured edges. The sprawling estates gave way to dense forests of skeletal oaks and evergreens, and the sky, which had been merely gray at the estate, was now a heavy, suffocating blanket of charcoal clouds. Inside the SUV, the atmosphere was thick with a tension Victoria refused to acknowledge. She occasionally glanced at the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of Marcus's eyes. He wasn't like the other drivers she had known. Jenkins always kept up a stream of polite, mindless chatter about the weather or the garden, but Marcus was silent. He drove with a concentrated intensity, his large hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his gaze never wavering from the winding asphalt. To Victoria, his silence was unsettling. She was used to being performed for, used to the people around her filling the air with reassurances of her own importance. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the temperature outside plummeted. The first signs of the storm appeared as thin, icy needles of rain that lashed against the windshield with a rhythmic, metallic ping. Victoria finally pulled off her headphones when she felt the car slow down. They were pulling into a gas station that looked like a relic from a different century. The concrete was cracked, weeds pushed through the fissures, and the neon sign above the pumps flickered with a dying, spasmodic light. "Why are we stopping here?" Victoria asked, her voice sharp with immediate disapproval. "This place looks unsafe." Marcus didn't turn around. "We need fuel, ma'am. And the weather reports are getting worse. I need to check the local radar before we hit the pass. There's a significant system moving in faster than anticipated." "I told you I'm in a hurry," Victoria snapped, her anxiety manifesting as arrogance. "Can't we just find a proper station? Something with a franchise name." "This is the last stop for 30 miles, Marcus said calmly, his tone devoid of the irritation she was trying to provoke. "It's this or the risk of running dry in a blizzard." He stepped out of the car before she could argue further. Victoria sat back, clutching her designer leather purse to her chest like a shield. She watched him through the glass. He moved with a grounded, effortless confidence that made the environment seem even more hostile by comparison. Near the entrance of the dilapidated convenience store, a group of 4 local men leaned against a rusted pickup truck. They were dressed in heavy flannel and worn boots, their faces etched with the hard lines of mountain living. They watched Marcus with a cold, predatory curiosity. Victoria felt her heart begin to hammer against her ribs. She remembered her father's warnings about townies and the dangers of being stranded in places where the Ashworth name carried no weight. When one of the men spotted her through the window, he nudged his friend and pointed. The group began to saunter toward the SUV, their movements casual but deliberate. "Hey, princess!" one of them shouted, his voice muffled by the glass but clear in its intent. "You look a little lost. Why don't you come out here and tell us where you're headed?" Victoria shrank back into the leather upholstery, her hand hovering over her phone, ready to call the police, though she had no idea where the nearest station was. The man reached out and rapped his knuckles against her window, a sharp, intrusive sound that made her gasp. Suddenly, Marcus was there. He didn't run, he didn't shout. He simply stepped into the space between the man and the car door. He stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his presence as solid and unmovable as the mountain itself. He didn't reach for a weapon or make a threat, but there was something in the stillness of his posture, a controlled military lethality, that caused the air to shift. "The lady is traveling," Marcus said, his voice low but carrying a resonance that cut through the wind. "And we're just leaving." The man looked Marcus up and down, measuring the broad shoulders and the steady dark eyes that didn't blink. For a tense, agonizing 10 seconds, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the man chuckled, a hollow sound, and backed away. "Just being neighborly, man. No need to get tense." Marcus didn't move until the men had returned to their truck. He finished fueling the SUV, paid at the pump, and got back inside. Victoria was trembling, her face pale. "You chose a dangerous place to stop," she said, her voice trembling with leftover adrenaline. She wanted to thank him, but the years of her father's conditioning made the words feel like a betrayal of her status. Instead, she chose to blame him. "You put me in a position where I was harassed." Marcus started the engine, his expression unreadable. "I put you in a position where we have a full tank of gas and a chance of making it through the pass." "More what?" "What?" Victoria blinked. "You were going to say you wanted to stop somewhere more," Marcus said, catching her eye in the mirror. "More civilized? More like your world? Out here, Miss Ashworth, civilized is whatever keeps you alive. And right now that's this car and my driving." Victoria turned her head toward the window, her face burning with a mix of shame and fury. She wanted to fire him. She wanted to call her father and demand he be replaced. But as the SUV pulled back onto the road, the rain turned into fat, wet flakes of snow that obscured the world in a white veil. The wind began to howl, rocking the heavy vehicle, and Victoria realized with a sinking dread that the stranger in the front seat was the only thing standing between her and the mountain. "We should find a motel," Marcus said after a few miles of silence. "The visibility is dropping to near zero. It's not safe." "No," Victoria said, her voice cracking but stubborn. "My father is expecting me. I have a schedule. You're being paid to drive, not to offer travel advice. If you can't handle a little snow, perhaps you shouldn't be in this profession." Marcus's jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in his cheek, the first sign of genuine emotion she had seen from him. "As you wish, Miss Ashworth," he said quietly. They began the steep ascent into the pass. The road narrowed, twisting like a snake around the jagged edges of the peaks. The snow was no longer falling. It was being hurled by the wind, a whiteout that turned the headlights into useless glowing orbs. Victoria looked down over the edge of the road, seeing nothing but a black abyss where the guardrails had been buried. She realized then that she had made a terrible mistake, but her pride was a cage she didn't know how to unlock. The real storm hadn't even begun. The ascent into the mountain pass felt like a slow crawl into the jaws of a white beast. The silence inside the SUV was no longer a matter of social discomfort. It was the silence of a cockpit before a disaster. Outside, the world had vanished. There was no road, no sky, and no horizon, only a swirling hypnotic chaos of white. The windshield wipers groaned under the weight of the accumulating ice, struggling to clear a small arc of visibility for Marcus. Victoria gripped the leather handle above the door so tightly her knuckles had turned as white as the snow outside. Every time the wind gusted, the heavy vehicle shuddered, its tires fighting for purchase on a surface that had turned into a sheet of glass. The arrogance she had wielded like a weapon at the gas station had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollow terror that sat in the pit of her stomach. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice stripped of its usual sharpness. "I can't see the road." "Do you see the road?" "I'm following the reflectors on the guardrails," Marcus replied, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. "But they're disappearing. We need to find a turnout, Victoria. Now." But Victoria's fear had reached a point of irrationality. She thought of her father's voice, the way he would look at her if she failed this simple task, the way he would call her weak. "No. We're almost there. The GPS says." "The GPS doesn't know the road is icing over." Marcus snapped, his professional veneer finally cracking. "I am trying to keep us on the mountain." "You're the driver," she screamed back, her panic boiling over into a blind, desperate rage. "This is your fault. You should have known. You people always find a way to screw things up." The words hung in the air, ugly and poisonous, but the mountain didn't care about her prejudice. At that exact moment, the front right tire hit a patch of black ice concealed beneath a fresh drift. The SUV didn't just slide. It pirouetted. Victoria felt the sickening weightlessness of the vehicle as it lost its grip. The world became a kaleidoscope of spinning lights and white darkness. Marcus didn't scream. He worked the wheel with a frantic, rhythmic precision, trying to steer into the slide, his muscles bulging against the fabric of his suit jacket. For a heartbeat, it felt like they might recover, but then came the sound of a structural failure. A massive hemlock, burdened by centuries of growth and 1,000 pounds of fresh ice, gave way above them. It didn't fall slowly. It dropped like a hammer. The tree slammed across the hood of the SUV just as they slid off the shoulder. The impact was a violent, bone-jarring symphony of shrieking metal and shattering glass. The airbags exploded with a deafening thud, filling the cabin with a fine, acrid powder. The SUV tumbled down a short, steep embankment before coming to a rest against a jagged outcrop of rock. Then there was silence. Victoria's head was ringing. The smell of scorched rubber and pine needles filled her senses. She tried to move, but her body felt like it had been tenderized by a mallet. The passenger side was crushed, the door pinned shut by the fallen tree. Snow was already beginning to hiss through the shattered windows. "Marcus?" she croaked, her voice barely a breath. Beside her, Marcus was slumped over the steering wheel. A gash across his forehead was weeping dark blood, staining the white fabric of the airbag. For a terrifying minute, Victoria thought he was dead. She was alone in a metal tomb, halfway down a mountain in a blizzard. Then, Marcus groaned. He pushed himself back, his eyes unfocused for a moment before they locked onto hers. Even in the dim, chaotic light of the wrecked cabin, his first instinct was her safety. "Are you broken?" he asked, his voice gravelly and thick. I don't think so, she sobbed, the first real tears of her adult life spilling down her cheeks. But the door. I'm trapped, Marcus. I can't get out. The SUV shifted, sliding another few inches toward the deeper ravine below. The metal groaned in protest. Marcus didn't waste time with words. He threw his shoulder against his own door, forcing it open against the mounting snow. He disappeared into the whiteout, and for a second, Victoria thought he had left her. But then, his face appeared at her shattered window. He began pulling away the jagged shards of glass with his bare hands, ignoring the way they sliced into his skin. I need you to unbuckle, he commanded. The car is unstable. We have to move now. With trembling fingers, Victoria clicked the release. Marcus reached through the frame, his large blood-stained hands grabbing her by the waist. He pulled her out of the wreckage just as the SUV gave one final metallic sigh and slid further down the slope, disappearing into the white void. They stood together in the knee-deep snow, the wind whipping around them with a predatory howl. Victoria looked at the man she had insulted, the man she had feared, and realized that her designer coat and her father's name were worth nothing here. Marcus stood between her and the abyss, his blood dripping into the snow, already looking for a way to survive. We walk, he said, shielding her eyes from the wind. Stay in my shadow, Victoria. Do not stop moving. The walk was an exercise in slow-motion agony. Victoria's designer heels, which had cost more than a month of a working man's wages, were worse than useless. They were sabotage. Every step into the deep, powdery drifts caused her ankles to roll, the sharp stiletto points sinking into the hidden mud beneath the snow. The wind was a physical weight, pushing against her chest, trying to steal the very breath from her lungs. I can't do this, Victoria cried out, her voice swallowed by the roar of the blizzard. She collapsed into the snow, the cold seeping through her expensive stockings with a bite that felt like 1,000 needles. Marcus stopped. He didn't look back with pity, but with a grim necessary resolve. He trudged back to her, his own shoes filled with ice, his suit jacket soaked through. Without a word, he knelt in the snow. Your shoes, he commanded. Take them off. What? I'll freeze. You'll break your neck first, Marcus said. He didn't wait for her to comply. He reached out, unbuckling the useless straps and tossing the heels into the white void. Then, he began to unbutton his own coat. Underneath, he pulled off his thick wool socks. Put these on. They'll give you traction. I'll wrap your feet in the emergency blankets from my pocket. Victoria watched him, stunned into silence. He was standing in the middle of a mountain blizzard, exposing himself to the elements to give her a chance to walk. The difference, she had been taught to fear, was now the only thing keeping her upright. As he helped her slide the warm, heavy wool over her numb toes, she felt a flare of heat in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the first time in her life someone had sacrificed their comfort for hers without an invoice attached. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't thank me yet, he said, pulling her to her feet. I saw a trail marker back there. There's a summer hunting cabin about half a mile up this ridge. If we don't find it in 20 minutes, we won't find anything at all. They moved like a single, wounded organism. Marcus broke the trail, his broad shoulders acting as a shield against the gale, while Victoria followed in his footsteps, her hands gripping the back of his belt. Just as her legs felt like they were turning into lead, a dark, jagged shape appeared through the swirling white. It was an old timber cabin, its porch buried in drifts, its windows dark and hollow. It looked like a ghost, but to Victoria, it was a cathedral. Marcus threw his shoulder against the door. It was locked, but the wood was dry and brittle. With one violent shove, the latch splintered, and they tumbled into the stagnant, freezing air of the interior. The cabin was a single room, smelling of cedar, old dust, and the ghosts of previous winters. Marcus didn't rest. He moved with a frantic efficiency, finding a stack of seasoned pine by the hearth and a box of strike-anywhere matches on the mantel. Within minutes, A small orange flame was licking at the kindling. Victoria sat on a moth-eaten sofa, wrapped in a dusty sheet she'd found in a trunk. She watched Marcus as he tended the fire. The light cast long dancing shadows across his face, highlighting the dried blood on his forehead and the steady, focused line of his mouth. "You're bleeding again," she said, her voice trembling. Marcus touched his brow and winced. "It's just a scalp wound. They bleed a lot. I'll be fine once I get the chill out of my bones." "Why did you do it?" Victoria asked suddenly. The question had been burning in her mind since the crash. "In the car. I said those things. I was horrible to you. You could have just left me. You could have walked away and saved yourself." Marcus looked at her across the flickering firelight. His eyes were dark and deep, holding a weariness that went beyond the storm. "My father was a preacher in Detroit, Victoria. He taught me that a man isn't defined by how he's treated, but by how he treats those who can do nothing for him. You were a passenger in my car. That makes you my responsibility. Your words don't change my job." Victoria looked down at her hands. They were red and shaking. For 28 years, she had been told she was superior because of her name, her bloodline, and her bank account. But sitting in this shack, she realized she was the weakest person in the room. She was the one who couldn't start a fire, couldn't find her way, and couldn't even walk through the snow without a stranger's help. "I'm not a passenger anymore," she said softly. "I'm just me." "Then me needs to eat," Marcus said, a small tired smile touching his lips. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crushed protein bar he'd been carrying. He broke it in half and handed her the larger piece. As they sat in the growing warmth of the fire, the storm howling like a banshee against the logs of the cabin, the walls Victoria had built around her heart began to crumble. The man sitting across from her wasn't a driver or a stranger. He was the first person she had ever truly seen. The second day in the cabin began with a silence so profound it felt heavy, a stark contrast to the violent cacophony of the previous night. The wind had died down to a low, mournful whistle, and the world outside the frosted, hand-blown window panes was a masterpiece of lethal beauty, white, still, and utterly indifferent to the two souls trapped within its icy grip. Inside, the fire had dwindled to a bed of glowing rubies, casting a dim, amber warmth across the room. Victoria woke under a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket, the scent of cedar, old fabric, and wood smoke clinging to her skin like a new identity. Marcus was already awake. He stood by the window, his large frame silhouetted against the pale, diffused morning light. He looked like a statue carved from shadow, his presence grounded and watchful. "The snow is up to the porch roof," he said without turning, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space. The wind drifted it high against the door. "We're not going anywhere today, Victoria. Maybe not tomorrow either." Victoria sat up, feeling muscles she never knew she possessed ache in sharp protest. Her body felt battered, but her mind was strangely clear. For the first time in 28 years, the static of her life had been cut. There was no Sarah to bring her coffee, no Preston to chime in with a vapid comment about the stock market, and no father to dictate the rhythm of her breathing. There was only the crackle of the hearth and the man standing by the window. "What do we do now?" she asked. It was a question she had asked 1,000 times in her life, usually directed at a personal assistant or a stylist. But here, the question carried the weight of true survival. "We survive," Marcus replied, finally turning to look at her. He had found an old tin percolator in a cupboard and was heating water on a flat stone at the edge of the hearth. "And maybe you tell me why a woman who has everything money can buy looks like she's been running from a ghost since the moment I picked her up." The conversation that followed lasted for hours, unfolding as the sun moved slowly across the white sky. Victoria found herself pouring out truths she had never dared to whisper to her closest friends at the country club. She spoke of the golden cage her father had built, a world where every smile was a transaction and every relationship was a strategic alliance. She spoke of the crushing weight of being an Ashworth, where her only job was to look perfect and remain silent. My father told me that the world is divided into two kinds of people, she said, staring into the flickering flames. The wolves and the sheep. He told me that anyone outside our circle was a predator looking to take what we had. He taught me to look at people like you, people who actually work, who actually know how the world functions, and see only a threat. Marcus listened with a patience that was unnerving. He didn't interrupt with platitudes or defensive anger. He merely reflected. He told her about growing up in Detroit, the son of a man who fixed cars and hearts with equal precision. He told her about the army, the cold reality of the desert, and the loss of his unit, a loss that had stripped away his own illusions of invincibility. Your father was wrong, Victoria, Marcus said, sitting on a wooden crate across from her. The world isn't divided into wolves and sheep. It's divided into people who are afraid and people who have learned to use that fear to grow. You think you're weak because you can't start a fire or navigate a blizzard. But you're sitting here, alive, after a crash that should have killed you. You haven't broken yet. That's not weakness. That's just a lack of training. He reached out and handed her a mug of hot water flavored with a single found tea bag. As their fingers brushed, Victoria didn't flinch. The difference her father had obsessed over felt like a fever dream that had finally broken. She looked at Marcus's hands, calloused, scarred and steady, and then at her own, which were pale and trembling. I've spent my whole life being handled, she whispered. I don't even know who I am when there's no one around to tell me what to think. This is who you are, Marcus said softly. The woman who survived the mountain. The woman who apologized to a stranger when she didn't have to. That's the version of you I'd bet on. As the afternoon light faded into a deep, bruised purple, the intimacy in the cabin grew. It wasn't the shallow, practiced intimacy she shared with Preston, which was built on shared zip codes and tax brackets. This was raw and terrifying. Victoria realized that Marcus saw her more clearly in 24 hours than her fiancé had in 3 years. He saw the fire beneath the ice, the woman who was tired of being a trophy. She reached out and took his hand, her thumb tracing the line of a scar on his palm. For the first time in her life, she wasn't thinking about the consequences or the scandal. She was thinking about the heat of his skin and the steady beat of a heart that didn't care about the Ashworth name. If we get off this mountain, she said, her voice catching, everything changes. My father. He won't let this go. He'll try to destroy you for even seeing me like this. Let him try, Marcus said, his grip on her hand tightening. The mountain already tried to kill me, and I'm still here. Your father is just a man with a checkbook. I've faced much worse than that. In the deepening shadows of the cabin, Victoria Ashworth began to grieve. She grieved for the years she had wasted being afraid, for the hate she had been taught to carry, and for the hollow girl she had been. But as she leaned her head against Marcus's shoulder, she felt a new kind of strength taking root. The thaw had begun, and no amount of mountain ice could stop it. The rescue came at dawn on the third day, a violent intrusion of technology and noise that shattered the fragile sanctuary they had built. The rhythmic, guttural thrum-thwack of a search and rescue helicopter vibrated through the cabin's timber walls, rattling the chipped tea mugs and shaking dust from the rafters. Victoria woke with a start, her head resting on Marcus's shoulder. For a fleeting, panicked second, she wanted to hide, to bar the door and stay in the shadows where the world made sense. They're here, Marcus said. His voice was flat, devoid of the relief she expected. He stood up, the warmth of his presence leaving her side, and moved to the door. As he pulled it open, a swirl of bitter, blinding white light flooded the cabin. The transition was a blur of professional efficiency. Men in bright orange parkas burst into the room, their voices loud and clipped, speaking a language of vitals, coordinates, and logistics. Victoria was immediately draped in a high-tech thermal blanket, a crinkling silver shroud that felt cold against her skin. She tried to reach for Marcus, to say something, anything, but the rescuers moved like a wall between them. Miss Ashworth? I'm Miller. We're going to get you out of here, a paramedic said, checking her pupils with a light that felt like a physical assault. Is he okay? Marcus, is he? The driver is being seen to, ma'am. Let's get you to the skid. As she was ushered toward the waiting helicopter, Victoria looked back. Marcus was standing by the cabin door, surrounded by 2 other rescuers. He looked back at his former self, the professional driver, the mask of neutrality sliding back over his features like a visor. He didn't wave. He didn't shout. He simply watched her go, his eyes holding a somber understanding of what was about to happen. The landing zone was a makeshift command center at the base of the mountain pass. The moment the helicopter blades slowed, the world of the Ashworths reclaimed her. Grant Ashworth was standing by a black limousine, his face a mask of controlled, icy fury. Beside him stood Preston, looking absurdly out of place in a designer cashmere overcoat and leather gloves that had never touched a day of hard work. "Victoria!" Preston cried, rushing forward as she was helped down. He reached to embrace her, but she flinched, his cologne smelling cloying and artificial after the scent of wood smoke and pine. "Baby, thank God. You look... well, you're safe now." Her father didn't offer an embrace. He looked at her tattered coat, Marcus's jacket, which she still had draped over her shoulders, with a look of profound revulsion. "Get her into the car," Grant ordered his security detail. "I want a full medical team at the estate, and I want the lawyers briefed on the driver's negligence." "Negligence?" Victoria's voice came out as a raspy croak. "Dad, he saved me. He walked me through a blizzard. He gave me his clothes to keep me from freezing." Grant Ashworth leaned in, his eyes like 2 chips of flint. "He crashed the vehicle, Victoria. He put a high-profile client in a life-threatening situation because he lacked the judgment to stop. In our world, results are the only metric. He failed, and he will be dealt with." "No," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger. "You don't understand." "I understand that you are traumatized," her father snapped. "I understand that you spent 48 hours in a shack with a stranger and your mind is playing tricks on you. We will fix this. We will erase this mistake." The ride back to the estate was a nightmare of silence and suffocating luxury. Preston chatted aimlessly about the stress the wedding planners were under due to her disappearance, while her father sat on his phone, issuing dictates that sounded like death warrants. By the time they reached the mansion, Victoria learned the extent of the fix. Grant had already contacted the agency. Marcus Thorne had been fired for gross professional negligence. A civil suit had been filed to strip him of his certifications, and her father's legal team was already pressuring the local police to investigate Marcus for endangering a minor, a reach so desperate and cruel it made Victoria's blood run cold. She was sequestered in her room, a recovery period that felt more like house arrest. Sarah brought her tea, her eyes downcast, sensing the tension. Preston sent flowers. But Victoria sat by the window of her marble solarium, looking at the distant blue peaks of the mountains. She realized then that her father wasn't trying to protect her. He was trying to protect the idea of her. He was trying to kill the woman who had woken up in that cabin. He wanted the sheep back. He wanted the girl who didn't know how to start a fire. That night, for the first time in her life, Victoria didn't ask for permission. She waited until the house was silent, until the security guards were on their late-night rotation. She went to her safe, took out the jewelry her mother had left her, pieces her father didn't track, and the emergency cash she had started hiding months ago, just in case. She didn't take a car from the garage. She called a generic rideshare service, waiting at the end of the long, dark driveway. As she looked back at the sprawling Ashworth estate, it didn't look like a home. It looked like a museum of dead things. "Where to, miss?" the driver asked. Victoria looked at the address she had scribbled on a piece of paper, the address of a small, struggling garage in a part of the city her father had never set foot in. "The industrial district," she said. "And please drive fast." The return to the real world wasn't a rescue. It was a breakout. Victoria Ashworth was going to find the man who had seen her soul, and she was going to burn every bridge behind her to do it. The industrial district of the city was a jagged landscape of rusted iron, corrugated metal, and the persistent, heavy scent of diesel and old grease. It was a world that didn't care for the Ashworth name, a place where the air was thick with the grit of labor rather than the perfume of privilege. Victoria stepped out of the rideshare vehicle, her designer boots clicking hollowly against the cracked pavement. She felt like an alien in her own skin, still dressed in the expensive silks of her former life, now wildly out of place amidst the hulking skeletons of abandoned factories. She found the address at the end of a dead-end street. Thorne's Automotive. The sign was small, hand-painted, and peeling at the corners. The garage door was half open, revealing a cavernous space filled with the rhythmic clink-clink-clink of metal hitting metal. Victoria stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the center of the bay, suspended by chains, was the engine of an old muscle car. Beneath it, lying on a creeper, was a man. Even with his face partially obscured by a smudge of oil, she knew the set of his shoulders. "Marcus," she whispered. The sound of the wrench stopped. The creeper rolled out from under the car with a slow, deliberate scrape. Marcus sat up, wiping his hands on a rag that was more black than white. He didn't look surprised. He looked weary. He looked like a man who had been waiting for the other shoe to drop. "You shouldn't be here, Victoria," he said, his voice sandpaper rough. "Your father's lawyers were here yesterday. They made it very clear that any contact between us would be considered harassment on my part. I've already lost my license. I'm trying not to lose my life." "I don't care about the lawyers," Victoria said, stepping closer, ignoring the oil stains blooming on her hem. "I know what he did. I know he destroyed your business. I know he's trying to erase you." Marcus stood up, and for the first time since the rescue, Victoria saw him clearly. The gash on his forehead had healed into a thin, jagged line, a permanent souvenir of the mountain. He looked older, harder, but those dark eyes still held the same steady light she had seen in the cabin. "He didn't just erase me, Victoria. He's trying to save you," Marcus said, his voice softening. "And he's right about one thing. This isn't your world. Look at you. You're a princess in a junk pile." "I was a prisoner in a museum," she countered, her voice rising with a passion she had never known she possessed. "I spent 28 years being told what to think, who to love, and how to breathe. You're the only person who ever looked at me and saw a human being instead of an asset. I'm not going back, Marcus. I called off the wedding. I told Preston it's over." Marcus went still. "You did what?" "I ended it. And I told my father that if he doesn't stop his vendetta against you, I'll take every piece of information I have about his creative accounting during the Morrison merger to the federal investigators. I might have been a decorative doll, but I listened when he talked shop." A slow, grim smile spread across Marcus's face. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of respect. "You're playing a dangerous game, Victoria. He'll disown you. He'll take the car, the accounts, the clothes on your back. You'll be standing in the rain with nothing but your name." "Then let him take it," she said, her chin lifting. "I've spent 3 days in a blizzard with a man who had nothing but his hands and his heart, and I've never felt more secure. I'd rather be hungry with you than full with them." Marcus stepped toward her, the space between them closing with the same magnetic inevitability they had felt in the cabin. He reached out, his grease-stained thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "It's not going to be a fairy tale. I'm working 18 hours a day just to keep the lights on in this dump. You'll have to learn to work. You'll have to learn to struggle." "I want to learn," she whispered. The kiss that followed was a collision of two worlds. It tasted of salt, iron, and the terrifying, beautiful scent of freedom. In that moment, the Ashworth estate, the trust funds, and the emerald silk dresses felt like a costume she had finally outgrown. But the silence of the garage was suddenly shattered by the glare of headlights. 3 black SUVs pulled into the lot, their engines idling with a low, predatory growl. The doors opened in unison, and Grant Ashworth stepped out, flanked by men whose suits cost more than the garage. "Victoria," her father's voice boomed, echoing off the corrugated walls. "Step away from that man. This is your final warning. Come home now, or you will find out exactly how cold the world is without me." Victoria didn't step away. She reached back and gripped Marcus's hand, her fingers locking with his. The iron of the truth had finally replaced the poison of her father's wisdom. The confrontation in the garage didn't end with a fight. It ended with a death. Not of a person but of a legacy. Grant Ashworth looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and realized for the first time that his most prized possession had become a person he could no longer control. "You're a fool," Grant had hissed before turning his back on her. "You think this love is worth the gutter? In 6 months, you'll be begging to come home. And when you do, the door will be locked." He was wrong. 6 months later, Victoria didn't find herself at the door of the mansion. She was at the door of a small 2-bedroom bungalow on the edge of the city. The paint was a bit faded, and the porch creaked, but the air inside was hers. Victoria sat at a small kitchen table, her fingers fly-clicking across a laptop. She had taken a job as an administrator for a local community center, using the organizational skills her father had once praised to help people who actually needed it. She was learning to budget, learning to cook, mostly surviving on charred toast and laughter, and learning that a life built with your own hands is sturdier than one built with a checkbook. Marcus came in through the back door, the smell of wood smoke and motor oil clinging to his skin. He had regained his certifications after a grueling legal battle, one Victoria had funded by selling her mother's diamond tiara. He was back to work, but not for an agency. He had opened Thorne and Ashworth Restorations, specializing in giving old broken things a second chance at life. "How was the day, partner?" Marcus asked, leaning down to press a kiss to her temple. "I managed to balance the center's books and didn't burn the lasagna," Victoria said, leaning back into his strength. "I'd call that a win." They stood together by the window, looking out at the city as the sun began to set. Far off, the lights of the wealthy districts were beginning to twinkle, but they looked like cold, distant stars. Here, in the small kitchen, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with a fireplace. Victoria thought back to the woman she had been, the girl who feared difference, the girl who thought her value was determined by the label on her coat. She realized that the blizzard hadn't been a disaster. It had been a gift. It had stripped away the designer armor to reveal the heart of a woman who was brave enough to choose the unknown. She had found a man who didn't treat her like a trophy or a task. He treated her like a person. And in the quiet moments of their new, difficult, beautiful life, Victoria realized that real strength wasn't about power or money. It was about the grace to respond to cruelty with kindness and the courage to walk out of a golden cage and into the storm. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be bills to pay, prejudices to face, and the lingering shadow of the Ashworth name. But as Marcus pulled her closer, Victoria knew she was no longer afraid. She had been awakened, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was meant to be.